Mind Your Farm Business on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I'm Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com and host of Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM. You can find more episodes of this podcast by going to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. In business, growth is pounded into us. Frequently, we hear quotes like, "You must have a growth mindset. If you're not growing, you're dying. Growth is the only evidence of life." Or how about this one from Warren Buffett? "The investor of today does not profit from yesterday's growth." While we fantasize and romanticize about growth, we routinely ignore approaching it with intent. Having a purpose to your business growth is something that growth enthusiasts forget to mention. Today's guest on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast is Michael Langemeier. He's Associate Director for the Center for Commercial Agriculture and also Professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Let's get to the conversation about managing growth for your farm. Michael, welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Michael, a lot of farms are, whether they're in Canada or the U.S., they're looking to, see what's on the horizon. And on the horizon a lot of times is, growth. And growth can come in many forms or fashion. But doing it the right way for your particular situation is really key so you don't end up maybe stubbing your toe business-wise, so to speak. Why is this such an important topic?
Well, first of all, many times margins over time or margins per unit over time decline. And so you need to continually look at, what is my margin per unit, per acre, or per head of cattle, but then also look at what that means for the total return for the farm. And so many times, if you want to increase the total net income for the farm, you need to think about growing. But one of the things that's extremely important before you think about growing is you actually have some metrics. And so how do you compare in terms of a operating profit margin today compared with similar sized firms? And certainly if you're not competitive with respect to your profit margin, for example, you need to think about why. Is it a size issue, or is there something else going on my farm that's leading me to have a lower profit margin than several other farms? And that leads me into the reasons why farms think about growing. Assuming you have the information in front of you and looks like you're competitive at your current size, many farms think about growing to reduce costs, to increase these profit margins or increase net farm income, maybe to improve the utilization of equipment. Many times you need to grow in order to more fully utilize the combine or the sprayer or the planter. Also, you could be bringing in new family members. It may be a good mechanism to invest in retained earnings or past profit. Maybe you think that putting the money into the farm is better than putting it into a 401k, the stock market, or something else. And so there's a lot of different reasons to grow. But before you think about growing, you really need to know where you stand today.
And you mentioned the why. And I think that's such a critical component of this, because in some circumstances, growth may not be the best choice. It may be maybe cleaning up the house, so to speak, and really making some changes in the current scope of your operation instead of stepping out and thinking that growth is the solution. What have you found in that area?
That's precisely the case. That's why I think it's so important that a farm have a decent set of financial statements, a balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement, et cetera, so they really know where they stand today in terms of financial position and financial performance, because many times you can't grow yourself out of a problem. You've got to correct the problem and then think about growing. I mean, there's no magic to this economies of size. Larger does not necessarily mean lower per unit cost. It depends on the situation. It depends on whether you're growing for the right reason, or if you more specifically, whether you're already competitive. If you're not competitive at your current size, you're likely to not be any more competitive if you're twice as big as you currently are.
Yeah, we see this in more of like the corporate world where a company falters and they've had tremendous growth. Like Peloton's an example. I think that's a relevant example where there was huge growth, huge demand, it couldn't meet the demand with supply of the bikes. And then all of a sudden things kind of came crashing down because honestly, the growth came too fast. So managing that growth is also a critical component of this growth equation.
Yes, you bring up a very good point, and there's a couple issues there that are very important to consider. First of all, if you grow too fast, you're probably going to be left with very limited working capital and very little flexibility. What happens after you grow maybe 25%? Because growth in agriculture is very lumpy. Because we don't just add an acre, we add 160 acres or 320 acres, and so it's really lumpy. And growth can be quite rapid because it is lumpy. If we're renting an additional farm or we're buying an additional farm, the growth could be fairly big chunk. It could be fairly big percentages, and you always have to think about am I going to have sufficient net cash flow after I grow in case margins get tight. You don't want to be in a situation where you're draining all that liquidity, you're draining all that working capital that you face some challenging times, and then you got to go backwards because it can be really quite difficult many times to unravel growth, and so that's a very important consideration. Another thing that's talked a lot in the corporate world, and it's very true for agriculture too, is we don't want to just grow by expanding into anything. We have to think about is the enterprise we're looking at expanding, maybe it's a new enterprise even, how does that fit in with our current skill set in terms of managers, but also our resources? There's good growth and not so good growth, and so you have to really think about strategic fit. Am I really growing? Growing in a way that's going to take advantage of the resources, including our management ability, or not?
Yeah, there's diversification versus probably it's the scope versus scale kind of decision.
Definitely the scope versus scale, and traditionally the scope was extremely powerful. In the United States, the same is true in other countries, including Canada. We had a lot of crop livestock farms. The trend over time has been more specialization, and so we've tried to grow by specializing and taking advantage of economies of size. Now we're entering a period of time where perhaps that scope makes a little bit more sense, and so let me talk a little bit about that. And that's particularly the case if it looks like you're able to expand by looking at maybe some specialty crops, for example. And when I say specialty crops, I count waxy corn and popcorn as a specialty crop.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'm a corn producer today, but it looks like I might have this chance to maybe grow popcorn, or maybe grow waxy corn, or maybe grow white corn. And so that's more of a scope. Growth in terms of scope, and that's very important in today's world to think about that, because in some cases you don't need to necessarily add acres. You just need to think about different markets for the crops you're already producing.
Yeah, for sure. Now you sort of mentioned it a little bit earlier. Was sort of the forecast. Looking at not only your current numbers, but also looking at if I am going to have this growth plan, we're going to add, maybe these couple farms we're going to buy some more land, or maybe it's set up a second operation, or whatever that growth looks like. Having a forecast with some sensitivities to it allows you to probably hone in that decision making on what that growth should look like.
Yes, this is very closely related to a business plan. When you develop a business plan, you're always looking at the impact on financial performance and financial position, which would include liquidity and solvency, your debt structure in relationship to the assets. You're always looking at how growth or investing in an enterprise or several enterprises Expanding acres would be another example. You're always looking at how that might impact my financial performance. And it's not only profitability you're looking at. I go back to something I said earlier. It's also that debt structure. If we have to borrow a lot of money in order to grow, you need to carefully think about that and back up and say, now, wait a minute. Am I going to be able to service this additional debt if my margins are tighter in 23, 24 compared to what they were in 21 and 22? Also, you need to think about the impact on your managerial attention and oversight. Are we growing beyond our ability to manage? And this is particularly true if you have a farm that's only one person, or you have a farm that's maybe two people. There's limited managers in the business. Are we growing beyond our ability to wrap our hands around the entire farm and all the enterprises that we're trying to operate, and we're spread too thin in terms of our management time?
Oh, the measurement of and the expectation of management capacity. And I think this is something the entrepreneur, the farm owner, probably tends to underestimate. Oh, you know what? We'll be fine. We'll make it work. We'll work harder. Like I think a lot of times we estimate this one wrong.
Yes, I agree with that totally. Sometimes we think, well, we'll just work harder. Well, unfortunately, farming is very seasonal. And can you actually work harder during planting time or during harvest time, or you're already fully extended? The answer is you might be already working as hard as you possibly can, and so you may have to hire some additional people. And that brings up a whole nother topic. Do I have the skills or the desire to supervise more people? That a lot of times comes with growth, particularly if we're already stretched really thin in terms of our labor and management time.
We'll get back to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, but first a word from our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank.
This episode of Mind Your Farm Business podcast is brought to you by RBC. Maybe you've had an idea about upgrading your operation, or finally getting that renovation done, or buying some new equipment. Or you want to be a little less reliant on the weather from season to season. Get some help making it happen by speaking with an RBC Agriculture account manager. Then, set up an investment plan to make even more of your ideas happen. Visit rbc.com/chartyourcourse and get started today.
From your research, are there other things to avoid here when we're thinking about growth in our agricultural operations?
One of the big things to think about, and here I go back to the corporate world again, is just like in the corporate world, there's startup challenges when we're thinking about growing, particularly if we're thinking about diversification. And so when we're trying to develop this cash flow for something like, let's say we're a livestock farm and we're thinking about adding swine finishing to our operation. Maybe somebody coming back to the farm and it doesn't look like we can rent as many acres as we need to in order to bring this person back to the farm. And so in order to bring this person back, we're going to look at, adding some swine finishing barns to our operation. You need to carefully think about the startup challenges. First of all, you're probably going to expend a lot of money up front. You may not get cash flow for several months, and your net cash flow may not be positive for a year or two. And so you need to plan for that. And sometimes we forget to do that, and so we get into this cash flow crunch. And like I said earlier, it's a lot easier to expand than it is to back up and reverse the expansion. That can be extremely costly to reverse the expansion. You also need to think about management bottlenecks. If we don't have as much experience in this enterprise that we haven't had before, we haven't had for a long time, is there going to be some management bottlenecks to managing this new operation? And also consider any operational inefficiencies that there may be with this new operation. We think it's going to mesh really well with our other enterprises, but is that actually the case? Is this new enterprise, this new endeavor, is it taking our focus and our time away from what we do really well? And so all of these things need to be factored in. And one of the things I think is greatly underestimated sometimes sometimes is these startup challenges. This could be the startup challenges with adding an employee or adding another family member, but also from the finance standpoint, it may not go as smoothly as what it looked like it's going to on paper.
So there's a word that has not come up yet, and I'm actually surprised it hasn't, and it has to do with growth for the right reasons. One of the wrong reasons is ego. That is a trap of disaster.
Yes, definitely, and that's why really if you're going to add a family member, for example, you're probably going to grow relatively rapidly. It's important to come up with a plan and really think through the situation, before you just grow for the sake of growth. And so, definitely growing for the right reasons is extremely important. And also, it's related to something I like to talk about, and again, this is something that's discussed quite a bit in the corporate world, is what is my sustainable growth rate? And what I mean by that is based on my retained earnings or my retained profits over time, how fast could I grow with limited addition of debt? And look at that scenario, because, obviously one of the big concerns about growing rapidly is that increase in debt. And from the research I've done and the research I've examined, over time, there's nothing you can do on the farm that increases risk faster than adding debt.
Well,
essentially what debt does is it increases the variability of your cash flow. And in years when the prices are relatively low, you still have to come up with those debt payments. And so sometimes that could be a real struggle. And so that's why growing for the right reasons is so important.
When it comes to working capital, cash is king. And this all ties into where I was going to go next is, the timing aspect. You can have a growth plan. It makes sense, from a sustainable standpoint. You figure out the management capacity, but maybe the environment, the timing could be wrong. We're facing right now, if you're concerned about working capital and you're looking at, where maybe interest rates are going here in the next 12 months as central banks get a little bit hawkish trying to fight inflation, you may want to pause, or you may want to forge ahead depending on your particular situation, right? Timing's important.
Timing is very important, and that's why many times you don't want to bite off too much at once. And so the classic case here I keep referring to is the case that comes up a lot. We're bringing another person back to the farm, and we know that we are going to have to increase in size in order for there to be sufficient income on the farm and to be able to replace assets in a timely fashion. We know that's the case. We're not big enough to fully employ that person and generate enough cash flow so that person is going to be able to have a decent family living expenditure. And so rather than trying to do that all at once, doing that over time. Now, that's easier said than done because guess what? The availability of ground to rent, the availability of ground to purchase is really lumpy. And so sometimes these opportunities happen at once, but I still go back to the old adage, don't try to bite off more than you can chew. And so I think you have to do this in a very slow fashion, more of a deliberate fashion, and not try to grow too fast, because you really could run into some difficulty trying to repay debt if you're growing too fast.
Yeah, great advice. Michael, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. Important topic. You discussed it so well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Growing with reckless abandon is not a sound business decision. Without some reins and a plan to that growth, just getting bigger for the sake of getting bigger is foolish and likely financially disastrous. We heard today all about having a plan for growth and making sure it's attached to a sound plan. If not managed properly, growth can lead to disaster. Lack of free cash flow, lack of capital, and staffing shortages are all symptoms of a poor growth plan, to just name a few. Think of it like your crops. Anybody can plant and harvest, but growing the crop to its full potential requires thought, some data, a little gut experience, and some calculated decision-making. For example, too much nutrients and you lodge the crop and reduce the yield and make harvest a real pain. Don't do the same with your business. Let's grow our business with a keen eye on the purpose for that growth. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you have any feedback or comments, please email me at shaney@realagriculture.com or call the Real Ag Feedback Line, 855-776-6147. You can find more episodes of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast by going to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Thanks to RBC Royal Bank, and until next time, keep on minding your farm business.